The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was far more horrifying than you imagine. The year was 1587, and England's winter winds howled through the stone corridors of Fotheringhay Castle, carrying whispers of what was about to unfold. But on this February morning, a different sound would soon fill the air. The hushed prayers of witnesses gathering to watch a queen meet her end, not with the swift mercy history remembers, but with a brutality that would haunt even the executioner who wielded the axe. What transpired that cold morning was not merely an execution, but a carefully orchestrated destruction of a woman who had once commanded the loyalty of two kingdoms. The popular imagination has sanitized Mary's death into something almost dignified, a martyred queen meeting her fate with grace. But the reality was far more sinister, far more calculated, and infinitely more cruel than the romantic tales would have you believe. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of how Elizabeth I ensured her cousin's complete annihilation. Before we continue this dark journey into one of history's most disturbing royal executions, make sure to subscribe to hear more tales of the shadows that lurk behind history's greatest moments. Mary Stuart had once been the most powerful woman in Europe, crowned Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old, her tiny fingers unable to grasp the scepter that would define and ultimately destroy her life. At the height of her power, she commanded not one but 2 thrones, as Queen of Scotland and Queen Consort of France. Contemporary accounts describe her as breathtakingly beautiful, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, eyes that shifted from grey to amber depending on her mood, and a bearing so regal that even her enemies acknowledged her magnetic presence. The transformation from this magnificent sovereign to the broken woman who would mount the scaffold at Fotheringhay represents one of history's most dramatic falls from grace. As a young queen, Mary had danced in the glittering halls of French palaces, speaking 5 languages fluently, composing poetry that moved courtiers to tears, and leading hunts where she could outride any man in her retinue. She had been educated alongside the future King of France, raised to believe in her divine right not just to rule Scotland, but to claim England's throne as well, a belief that would ultimately seal her fate. But power, especially female power in the 16th century, attracted enemies like blood draws sharks. Mary's own nobility, the very men who should have protected their queen, began plotting against her from the moment she returned to Scotland after her French husband's death. The Protestant lords resented her Catholic faith, the ambitious courtiers envied her authority, and even those who claimed loyalty were secretly negotiating with her enemies. The seeds of her destruction were being sown by the very hands that kissed her ring in public submission. The first signs of Mary's coming catastrophe appeared in the form of her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a man whose handsome face masked a soul corroded by ambition and paranoia. Initially, Mary had been captivated by Darnley's youth and vigor, seeing in him the perfect consort to strengthen her claim to the English throne. But the marriage quickly devolved into a nightmare of jealousy, violence, and betrayal. Darnley, consumed by his desire for the crown matrimonial, began plotting with Mary's enemies, even as he shared her bed. The tension reached its grotesque climax when Darnley conspired in the murder of David Riccio, Mary's Italian secretary, who was dragged from the Queen's presence and stabbed 56 times, while Mary, 6 months pregnant, was held at gunpoint, forced to watch as her friend's blood pooled across her chamber floor. The physical toll of these betrayals began to manifest in Mary's body long before her imprisonment. Court physicians noted that the Queen suffered from recurring episodes of what they called violent pains in her side, likely caused by a gastric ulcer exacerbated by the constant stress of assassination attempts and political machinations. Her once luminous skin grew pale, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she began experiencing fainting spells that left her unconscious for hours. The woman who had once danced until dawn now struggled to stand through state ceremonies without swaying from exhaustion and illness. The conspiracy that would ultimately lead to Mary's execution began with letters that may never have existed or may have been forged by her enemies, a mystery that historians still debate today. The infamous casket letters, allegedly written by Mary to the Earl of Bothwell, implicated her in Darnley's murder and suggested an adulterous affair that scandalized Europe. Whether genuine or fabricated, these documents became the weapon Elizabeth I needed to justify keeping her cousin imprisoned for 19 years. The net gradually tightened around Mary as former allies abandoned her. Protestant lords seized her infant son James, and even her own half-brother led armies against her. By the time Mary fled to England in 1568, seeking sanctuary from her cousin Elizabeth, she was already a ghost of her former self. The Queen, who had once commanded armies, now arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her magnificent jewels pawned or stolen, her loyal servants scattered or dead. Elizabeth, who had never met Mary in person, ordered her cousin confined for her own protection, beginning a captivity that would last nearly 2 decades. The English Queen's true motivation remains one of history's great debates. Was she protecting her realm from a Catholic threat, or was she eliminating a rival whose legitimate claim to the throne potentially exceeded her own? The years of captivity transformed Mary from a vibrant woman in her 20s to a prematurely aged prisoner whose body bore the scars of her confinement. She developed severe rheumatism from the damp, cold castles where she was held, her joints swelling so badly that some mornings she could not rise from her bed without assistance. Her famous auburn hair turned white before she reached 40, and she suffered from dropsy that caused her legs and abdomen to swell grotesquely. The Queen, who had once led Scottish troops into battle, now needed help to walk across a room. The final conspiracy that sealed Mary's fate, the Babington Plot of 1586, may have been as much Elizabeth's creation as Mary's downfall. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, had infiltrated every aspect of Mary's household, reading her letters before she did, controlling what information reached her, and possibly even forging the crucial correspondence that would condemn her. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of political theatre, with Mary denied legal counsel, prevented from examining the evidence against her, and forced to defend herself in English, a language she had not spoken regularly for years. When Mary was finally informed of her sentence on that February evening in 1587, witnesses reported a strange transformation. The woman who had seemed broken suddenly straightened, her grey eyes flashing with their old fire. "I am ready to die for my faith and my right," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of a sovereign rather than a condemned prisoner. But this moment of strength was brief, and servants later reported hearing her weeping through the night, not for her approaching death, but for the son she had not seen since he was 10 months old, the son who had publicly denounced her to curry favor with Elizabeth. The morning of February 8th dawned clear and bitter cold, ice crystals forming on the windows of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary had spent the final night in prayer, but also in careful preparation for the spectacle she knew awaited her. Understanding that her execution would be witnessed and reported across Europe, she chose her clothing with the deliberation of an actress preparing for her final performance. Beneath her black outer garments, she wore a crimson petticoat and bodice, the color of Catholic martyrdom, a detail she would reveal only at the crucial moment. The great hall of Fotheringhay had been transformed into a theatre of death. A scaffold, 2 feet high and 12 feet square, dominated the space, draped entirely in black cloth that seemed to absorb the weak winter light filtering through the windows. At its center stood the block, also covered in black, with an axe leaning against it that witnesses later described as poorly maintained, its blade dull and pitted with rust. Around the scaffold, 300 witnesses had gathered, local nobility mixed with officials sent by Elizabeth to ensure the deed was properly done. Unlike the jeering crowds at common executions, these spectators maintained an eerie silence, understanding they were witnessing not just a death, but a moment that would reshape the political landscape of Europe. Mary entered the hall with a dignity that surprised even her enemies. She walked slowly, partly from infirmity and partly from determination to maintain her regal bearing until the end. She wore a black satin dress embroidered with gold, a white veil flowing from her cap, and carried 2 ivory crucifixes that she clutched like talismans. 6 of her servants accompanied her, all weeping openly, but Mary's eyes remained dry. As she mounted the scaffold, several witnesses noted that she had to be helped up the steps, her swollen legs barely able to support her weight. Yet she refused to show any sign of pain. The executioner, a man named Bull who had come from London specifically for this task, approached to ask her forgiveness, as was customary. Mary's response revealed both her wit and her understanding of the political theatre surrounding her death. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said loudly enough for all to hear, "for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." But then she added in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "I pray you all bear witness that I die a true woman to my religion and like a queen defending my God-given rights." What happened next transformed the execution from state ritual to grotesque spectacle. As Mary's ladies helped her remove her outer garments, revealing the crimson underneath, gasps arose from the crowd. The symbolism was unmistakable. She was presenting herself not as a traitor, but as a martyr, her blood-red clothing a defiant final message to both Elizabeth and history. The executioner's hands reportedly trembled as he approached, whether from the cold or from the unprecedented nature of executing an anointed queen. Mary knelt at the block, her lips moving in Latin prayer, and stretched out her arms in a Christ-like pose. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," she called out 3 times. The executioner raised his axe, but what followed was not the swift mercy a queen deserved. The first blow missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head with a sickening crunch that witnesses said could be heard throughout the hall. Mary made no sound, but her body convulsed, and blood began pooling on the scaffold. The second blow struck her neck, but failed to sever it completely, leaving her head attached by sinews and skin as blood spurted in rhythmic pulses across the black cloth. It took a third stroke, delivered almost frantically by the panicked executioner, to partially separate the head, and even then he had to use the axe like a saw to complete the gruesome task. The crowd, initially silent, began to murmur in horror at the butchery they were witnessing. Some turned away, others fell to their knees in prayer, and at least one witness, according to contemporary accounts, fainted at the sight of the Queen's blood spreading across the scaffold in an ever-widening pool. When the executioner finally held up Mary's head, as tradition demanded, shouting, "God save the Queen!" a grotesque discovery shocked the witnesses into deeper horror. The auburn hair came away in his hand, revealing that Mary had been wearing an elaborate wig. Her actual hair, cropped short and grey-white, made her severed head appear far older than her 44 years, a skull-like visage that one witness described as more corpse than woman. The head fell from his grasp, rolling across the blood-soaked scaffold before coming to rest near the edge, its eyes reportedly still moving for several seconds. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of Mary's execution emerged moments after her death. As officials moved to clear the scaffold, they discovered Mary's small terrier dog had been hidden beneath her skirts throughout the execution. The animal, now soaked in its mistress's blood, refused to leave her body, whimpering and trying to nestle between Mary's severed head and her corpse. When servants finally pulled the dog away, it reportedly refused to eat and died within days, a final casualty of political necessity. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the deep unease, even among Mary's enemies, about what had transpired. The Dean of Peterborough, who had been present to offer Protestant prayers that Mary had refused, later wrote that he had never witnessed such barbarous butchery of a Christian soul. The executioner Bull fled Fotheringhay immediately after completing his task, reportedly never performing another execution. Even some of Elizabeth's own counsellors expressed private horror at the spectacle, understanding that they had witnessed something that crossed the boundaries of civilized statecraft. Elizabeth I's reaction to her cousin's execution provides one of history's most enigmatic psychological puzzles. Upon receiving news that the deed was done, the English Queen reportedly flew into a rage that lasted for weeks. She claimed she had never intended for the death warrant to be carried out, that her secretary had acted without her knowledge, and she wore mourning clothes for months afterward. Was this genuine grief for a cousin she had never met, but whose death she had orchestrated? Or was it the calculated performance of a monarch who understood that executing an anointed queen set a dangerous precedent that might one day be used against her? Court observers noted that Elizabeth aged visibly in the months following Mary's death, her famous red hair growing thin, her face developing deep lines that cosmetics could no longer hide. The disposal of Mary's remains added final insult to her tragic end. Her body was initially embalmed and placed in a lead coffin, but Elizabeth ordered it kept at Fotheringhay for 6 months before allowing burial. Contemporary accounts suggest this delay was deliberate, preventing Catholic supporters from making her grave a pilgrimage site while memories remained fresh. When Mary was finally interred at Peterborough Cathedral, it was in a ceremony deliberately stripped of royal honours. The woman who had been Queen of Scotland and France was buried like a minor noble, her grave unmarked for decades. Yet even in death, Mary's story refuses to follow the script Elizabeth had written. Her son, James, who had betrayed her in life, would succeed Elizabeth as King of England, uniting the very crowns Mary had dreamed of joining. One of his first acts as king was to exhume his mother's body and reinter it in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb even more magnificent than Elizabeth's. The inscription he ordered carved there reads, "Mother of Kings," a final vindication for a woman Elizabeth had tried to erase from history. The medical examination of Mary's body during its reinterment revealed details that cast new light on her suffering. The remains showed evidence of advanced arthritis, spinal deformation likely from years of inadequate exercise during imprisonment, and marks on the bones consistent with chronic malnutrition. These findings suggest that Mary's captivity involved deliberate deprivations designed to break her body as well as her spirit. The Queen, who had once feasted on delicacies at the French court, had spent her final years subsisting on bread and thin ale, her requests for proper food denied as security risks. Perhaps most intriguingly, documents discovered centuries later in Vatican archives suggest Mary may have been carrying diplomatic papers sewn into her clothing at her execution, papers that were never recovered and whose contents remain unknown. What secrets did Mary take to her grave? What final message had she hoped to preserve even in death? The blood-soaked garments were burned immediately after the execution on Elizabeth's specific orders, destroying any evidence they might have contained. This detail, confirmed by multiple witnesses but never explained, adds another layer of mystery to an already enigmatic death. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, ultimately stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of how power consumes even those who wield it. Elizabeth, in ordering her cousin's death, had solved an immediate political problem, but created a moral stain that would define her legacy. Mary, in her martyrdom, achieved a victory that had eluded her in life, becoming a symbol of resistance to tyranny that would inspire Catholics for generations. The scaffold at Fotheringhay had witnessed not just the death of a queen, but the birth of a legend. The grotesque nature of Mary's execution, the 3 blows, the wig falling away, the orphaned dog crying in the blood. These details were not accidents, but revelations of the true nature of political power, stripped of its ceremonial pretense. When we examine the full horror of that February morning, we see not the clean efficiency of state justice, but the messy, brutal reality of how power maintains itself through violence. Mary's severed head, aged beyond its years and stripped of its false beauty, serves as a memento mori, not just for individual mortality, but for the mortality of kingdoms built on blood. In those final moments on the scaffold, as Mary stretched out her arms and commended her spirit to God, she perhaps understood what Elizabeth could never admit, that the throne they both claimed was an altar that demanded human sacrifice, and that in killing her cousin, Elizabeth had merely confirmed that she too was both priestess and potential victim in this ancient ritual of power. The blood-soaked scaffold of Fotheringhay still echoes through history, reminding us that the difference between a queen and a condemned woman is often nothing more than the direction in which the political winds blow. The question that haunts us still: was Elizabeth truly ignorant of the death warrant's execution, as she so dramatically claimed? Or did the English Queen orchestrate not just Mary's death, but also her own elaborate performance of innocence, understanding that history would judge her less harshly if she appeared reluctant rather than eager to spill royal blood? The truth died with both queens, leaving us only with the blood, the silence, and the terrible knowledge of what power demands of those who seek to hold it. If this dark tale from history's shadows captivated you, subscribe now to uncover more stories of power, betrayal, and the terrible prices paid for crowns. The blood of queens may dry, but the lessons written in it remain forever wet.